When most beginner pianists start learning the piano, they sound like this. But what actually goes into making a song sound more like this? Well, today I'm going to take some of the simplest tunes that everybody learns on the piano, and I'm going to show you what you can do to them and how far you can actually push them. So let's get into it. And first up, we have Frère, Jacques, and this is usually played like this. Which is pretty boring and pretty simple. Now, the problem is with this song is that it pretty much only uses one chord. It's all based around a C major chord. And all of the notes in the song are based around those notes in the chord. So C's, E's, and G's. You get C, and then a D that goes to an E, and then a C, and then a C that goes to an E, and a C, and then an E that goes to a G, E that goes to a G, and then G, G, E, C, G, G, E, C, C, G, C, C, G, C. So most of the notes in the melody are C's, E's, and G's. And the only notes in the melody that aren't C's, E's, and G's are something called passing notes or auxiliary notes. And a passing note is a note that goes from one chord note to another. So this D. Its function is to get you from the C to the E. Or auxiliary notes, which are notes that go outside of a chord and back in. So G, G. That A is an auxiliary note because it's a note that goes out of the chord and then back to a note that's in the chord. So other than those passing notes and auxiliary notes, all of the notes are chord notes, and that chord is C major, C, E, and G, which makes this sound pretty boring. And even if we were to just add the chord into the left hand, it would still sound pretty bad. So the first thing that we can do to make this sound interesting is add some extra chords into the piece of music. Now, typically, the way to do this is to play a chord that works with the melody note that's happening at the time. So, for example, if I start on a C chord, the next melody note is a D. So if I find a chord that works with that D, I can add a chord on that note. So an example of this is a G chord, which has a D in it. So you could go... And then the next note is an E, so if I wanted to add a chord there, I could add an A minor chord, for example, because an A minor chord has an E in it. Now, if you are adding chords into a piece of music, you don't have to add chords onto every single note, so I might leave the next note just with that A minor chord still. Then, repetition is actually very useful because it gets a listener used to what they're listening to. In pop music, if you think of a chorus, that keeps on coming back in order to make you really familiar with the music. So in the second bar, because we have the same melody, we can also have the same chords. Now, we don't just have to play simple chords here. You can actually add notes to these chords as well to make them sound more interesting. So for this A minor chord, I'm actually going to add something called the seventh, which is where you play the three notes that make up the chord, plus an extra alternating note. So A, C, E, and G. So if I add that G into that final chord, you get something like... Now, in the next two bars, I'm actually going to use something called a suspension, and this is where you play a note that doesn't belong to the chord, but it goes to a note that does belong to the chord. So, for example, if I was playing a C major chord, and in the melody there was a D, this note doesn't work with the chord, but if it falls to a C, for example, then that sounds pleasing to listen to. It adds some tension and then release. So in this next section, we have the notes E, F, G. Now, I'm going to play an F chord with the E because the next note is an F. So this will be tense, but it'll go to an F, which will take away that tension. And then the next chord, there's a G in the melody, so I'm going to play a C chord. But this time, to make it sound a little bit more sensitive, instead of playing just a C chord, I'm going to put the E in the bass, which is the middle note of the chord. So I'll get something like... And once again, that gives me the stepwise motion in the left hand, going from F to E, and you've got the stepwise motion in the melody. The E, the F, and the G. Now, in the next bar, once again, I'm going to use the idea of a suspension, because the first note is a G, but it goes to an A. And I'm going to use an F chord again, because the G doesn't belong to that chord, but it makes it sound interesting. when you release the tension going through the A. And then here, I'm going to play a C chord, but with a G in the bass this time. And that's because in a C chord, a G is the top note of the chord. So it just adds a little bit more of an interesting sound to the music because we haven't used that version of the chord yet. And because the notes in the next bar are exactly the same, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. But the second time, I'm going to put the E back in the bass of the C chord. Just so that the left hand is going F, G, F, E, and that sounds more interesting to me. Now, in these last two bars, I'm going to play a chord on every single one of the notes. And the first note here is a C, and in order to continue this bass line, I'm going to land on a D. Now, a C is not in a D chord, but it is in a D7 chord, a D minor 7 chord. So the melody actually kind of turns that D chord into a D minor 7 chord instead. Then I'm going to play a C chord with an E in the bass, with the G that's in the melody, and then an F chord because the melody is a C and there's a C in an F chord. And then for the final bar, I'm going to replay the F chord with the C. Then I'm going to play a G chord with the G, and then a C chord with the C to finish it on the home chord. Just a quick interruption to let you know that I have just released a course called The Art of Understanding Music. In the course, I walk you through absolutely everything that you need in order to be able to interpret a piece of music, including dynamics, articulation, tempo, time signatures, key signatures, scales, common rhythm patterns, different types of chords, cadences, phrasing, how to use repetition and the structure of music, and much, much more. So if you want to be able to look at a piece of music and understand exactly how it's been written and why it's been written the way it has, then check out The Art of Understanding Music with the link in the description. Okay, back to the video. So altogether, with just the chords changed, that sounds like this. Now, to me, that sounds very interesting, and you can still tell what the song is. But obviously, we can do a lot more in terms of how we physically play this on the piano, and also how we take space and treat the timing of the music. Now, because I've gone for a more sentimental sound with a lot of these first inversion chords where you have the middle note of the chord in the bass, where it sounds kind of longing, I'm not going to do anything too crazy across the piano. Now, because this is a more sentimental pared down version, I'm going to have a go at playing this kind of further up on the piano so that it sounds more twinkly. And also, I'm going to take a lot more time, because really what I want to do is prioritize the feeling that I'm trying to convey, and I'm using this particular song as a vehicle to convey that. So if I just took out the melody altogether and just played the chords and had a mess around with some kind of melodic ideas to try and create that feeling, I might try do something like this. And I actually already kind of like that sound. It's taking the chords and it's adding some extra kind of colour into the music by playing some extra melodic lines and things like that. And also just by the way that I'm voicing the chords. So a lot of this is trying to add a little bit more density into that right hand by adding some flavour notes, let's say. So instead of just playing an F chord, for example, adding a G into that F chord, because that adds a little bit more of an interesting colour to the music. But another thing to consider is that when you are playing a piece of music, you don't just want it to sound static. If you play everything in the same way, then it's going to have one feeling. So what I might do is the first time play it kind of twinkly like that, but then I might play the melody again, but with a much more warmer and broader sound. So something down here. Something kind of like that, where I'm maybe adding some arpeggios in, so playing the chord but separated across that left hand to add a little bit more texture to the music. And just by virtue of playing it slightly lower down on the piano, and a bit more spread out, you get this kind of much warmer quality of sound to the music anyway. So as a complete thing, that might sound like this. Okay, next is the song Amazing Grace. And to play this just as it's written, it would sound something like this. Now, interestingly, with this song, we do have more chords going on to start with, so we don't have to make them all up ourselves. So just as it is, we can turn this into something that's slightly more interesting just by the way that we play it. And we could approach this in exactly the same way we approached the last one, where we play it high up to start with and then get warmer as it goes on. But with this song, I actually think it gives us an opportunity to start adding in some really interesting chords that aren't necessarily in the key of the piece that we're in. Now, Amazing Grace in this version is in C major, which is just the white notes. However, if we use the exact same principles that we had before, which is that we can add extra chords depending on what the melody note is, so if the melody note is an E, we can play a chord that contains an E. And the idea that things sound better when they're in stepwise motion. So you can go from an F to a C chord but with an E in the bass, and that sounds nice because you've got the F to the E and your ear can follow that stepwise motion. But we can also do the same thing by moving outside of notes that are usually acceptable within this scale. So for example, if we have the note E in the melody and we decide to play an A minor chord because an A minor chord contains an E, we could keep the E as part of the melody but move to an E major chord afterwards. Because even though an E major chord is not in this scale, it has a G sharp in it, because we've got the E that we're following with our ear, we can get away with that movement. And even better still, that G sharp we can put in the bass so that we're going from an A to a G sharp. And that sounds perfectly fine. We could then even go to E minor with a G in the bass, and that would also sound fine because our left hand is moving by stepwise motion, and all of these chords contain the note E. So for example, you could do something like this. And for that one melody note E, you're playing 3 chords. The next melody note in this piece is actually a D, and if we continue this pattern to an F sharp, that would give us a D major chord. And because the next melody note is a C and the next chord is an F, that allows us to continue that stepwise movement all the way down to F. So you get something like this. So there are lots of interesting ways that you can find interesting chords that aren't necessarily what you expect when you're listening to the song, and those are the ones that make it sound the most interesting. Now, because that's quite a lot of chords and a lot of change to throw in before we've really established the melody and the chords, I might only do that the second time around. So the first time, I might actually just stick to something really simple where you're just playing the chords in a more gospel harmonic kind of way. I also might change the chord in bar 6, which at the moment isn't anything, so it just stays as a C major chord. But because there is a C in the melody, it actually might be interesting to once again play a D minor chord with that C on top, giving me D minor 7. And once again, that gives you the stepwise motion from the D minor 7 chord to the C chord with the E in the bass, so you're getting kind of the D to the E, which feels kind of uplifting. Now, after that, there is a D in the melody, and we can do something kind of interesting here. One of the strongest relationships between chords in music is the relationship between chord 5 and chord 1, because that is something called a perfect cadence, and that sounds like a full stop or a period in the music. So if I play a piece in C major, and then play a G chord, which is chord 5, and then a C chord, that sounds nice and complete because that's a period in the music. So chord 5 to 1 is a very, very strong relationship. And because the next chord that's written into the music is a G chord, on this D, we can actually play a D chord because that is chord 5 in the key of G. So it's almost like we're changing key just for a moment, and we're going to play chord 5 in G to then play chord 1 in G. So it'll feel like we're landing on that G chord. And G is then chord 5 in C. So we're kind of getting chord 5 of chord 5. And in order to keep that stepwise motion, because we're coming from a C chord with an E in the bass, I could play a D chord with an F sharp in the bass, so that this is moving by step to then go to the G. Now after that we have a C chord. And in the music, this is followed by a C with an E in the bass. However, I think I might change this because we have a C in the melody to an F chord, but I might keep that C in the bass because there is a C in an F chord as well. So if I keep the C in the bass, then you get something like this. And that will just sound more satisfying when we go to the F. And the bass note changes because we've kept that C in the bass for 2 chords. Now, for this C chord that's after the F chord, I'm going to change that to a C with an E in the bass, just because of, once again, that stepwise motion and it sounds more longing. And it also means in the next bar where there is no chord, I can just play a C in root position again before we go to the G and finish on a C. And one final thing I might change to that chord sequence there is just after that G chord in the middle there, there's a lot of space to do nothing. So I think I might walk the notes up the piano or something like that to get to G7. And G7 is just a G chord with an F on the top. So essentially I'm walking the notes up to be able to add that F in. So now I'm going to play Amazing Grace twice through. The first time I'm going to stick to the original chords, and the second time I'm going to play my adapted chords to make it sound more interesting. Now, obviously, there are lots of ways that you can play this on the piano in order to create different effects. You can make this massive, you can make it sound virtuosic, you can make it sound really colourful and harmonic. I find that I am a much more sentimental player, so I always veer towards the things that sound the most kind of melancholy and nuanced. But this should just give you a few different ways that you can kind of change songs in order to make them sound more interesting to you. So let me know what you thought of my new versions of those songs in the comments. And if you want to find out what happy songs sound like when they're played in a minor key, then head on through and I will see you there.